Hi und herzlich willkommen zum HoloLab 3. Ich bin Fabian Reit. Ich habe zusammen mit Jasmin Grimm für Rosie DX zusammen mit der Kulturstiftung des Bundes das Programm für dieses HoloLab kuratiert. Ich freue mich sehr, jetzt auch Sissel Marie Tonn begrüßen zu können. So a warm welcome to Sissel Marie Tonn. I'll just switch to back and forth to German because I need to explain how you find the translation as well. So für die Personen, die den Vortrag lieber auf Deutsch hören wollen, es gibt unten so einen kleinen Button, da kann man draufdrücken, dann kriegt man die deutsche Synchronisation-Fassung des Vortrags und kann dann den Vortrag einfach auf Deutsch verfolgen. Wer auf Gather unterwegs ist, kann dann einfach nach rechts gehen. Neben der Bühne ist auch so ein kleines Feld mit einer kleinen Fahne drauf und da kann man draufklicken und den Vortrag dann auch auf Deutsch hören. Now I'll switch back to English. It's a pleasure to have you here, Sissel Marie Tonn. Because for me, we're really excited to have you because I think you're combining science, research, art, and also a fiction level in your artwork on the daily basis. And it's really great to have you. You received the BAD Award, not the BAD Award, but the Bio Art and Design Award last year for your work. And I think it's great to have you. And I'm glad to hear your keynote now, or your presentation.
Thank you so much, Fabian. Do you hear me all okay? Yeah? Okay. Great. I'm going to get started. You see my slides? All right. So my name is Sissel Marie Tonn. I'm really happy to be here. I'm a Danish artist who's living and working in The Hague in the Netherlands. And I would like to talk a little bit about some of my work. And actually, there was another title on my presentation, but now it's called Becoming Sentinels, Speculative Technologies and Narratives for Cultivating Ecological Awareness, which I hope will make sense in a little bit. All right, so when I was a kid, both of my grandmothers would claim that they could feel when the weather was about to change in their bodies. So for my paternal grandmother, I believe this was because of her severe rheumatoid arthritis and her many artificial joints swelling and paining when the air pressure changed. And for my maternal grandmother, I imagine it would be due to decades of working on the family farm, having one's livelihood depend on the weather, which just kind of made her more aware of the subtle shifts in the atmosphere, which I myself could never feel. This anecdote has stayed with me in part because it reminds me that I've always been interested in the many ways in which we're entangled with our surrounding environments. So in most of my work, I reflect on the questions of where do we perceive our bodies to end and the environment around us to begin, and the ways in which our surroundings leave traces behind inside us, both material and immaterial. And increasingly, in the last years, I've also started noticing the kind of stories we tell to make sense of this complex relationship between our own bodies, the bodies of others, and the surrounding world. So if the first video could play, please. So for instance, the work you see here, called Sensory Cartographies from 2016, my collaborator Jonathan Roos and I were invited to a residency in Madeira to develop a project about the relationships between the sensing bodies and environmental mapping technologies. So we wanted to examine the limitations and the filtration mechanisms that are at play in both. And we had learned that when we experience the world, our brain body constantly filters out impressions to make sense of the world, so as to not get a sensory overload of everything that's going on all at once. Now, these acts of filtration are not only evolutionarily conditioned, they're also highly cultural. Therefore, our navigation of space is not universal or neutral, and neither are mapping technologies, who similarly reduce the rich multiplicities of the world into a set of navigable data. So during this residency, we wanted to create new kinds of mapping tools that would take into consideration the selective and the predictive mechanisms of our sensing bodies in encountering a constantly changing environment. We traveled to the primordial forests of Madeira, where the flux of the environment can be felt very viscerally. And we developed this site-specific performance with biosensor-equipped gloves, a wearable data logging and data sonification system, and these imaginary body extensions for subjectively mapping out the landscape in a completely new way. We imagine wearing these devices as a kind of meta-sensing, so using one's body as a biological sensor of the environment. And by using these wearable biometric measurement instruments, we translated our autonomic nervous system activity and heart rate, which was changing as we encountered all the different changes and elements within the environment, into this real-time sonic score that then again affected us in different ways as we encountered the environment. All right. So through our collaboration as sensory cartographers, we're interested in finding out how do we come to know our constantly changing environments through these ever-filtering, attention-scattered brain bodies of ours. And how do the technologies we use further filtrate and curate our knowledge about these environments? And finally, how can we, as artists, challenge and augment these relations? So more recently, our part of our practice is also inviting other makers and cartographers to collaboratively pressure cook ideas, which can be seen here during our Augmented Attention Lab session at Sensorium Festival in Bratislava in 2019. Another collaborative project of ours called the Intimate Earthquake Archive is also about the extraction and archiving of data. So for the past 34 years, inhabitants of the northernmost Dutch province of Groningen and Drenthe have experienced what's called man-made earthquakes. And these earthquakes are caused by decades of intense gas drilling in one of the largest natural gas fields in Europe, called the Groningen gas field. So as the public consciousness of this phenomenon has grown over the last decades, the Dutch government has increased efforts to survey the subsurface of the country, resulting in an overwhelming amount of data stored in both digital and physical archives. So in the National Core Sample Storage Center, for instance, which you can see a picture from here, you're met with endless rows of boxes of all the core samples that have been taken from the Dutch subsurface in the search for oil and gas. The most intriguing archive, however, to us was the public digital data bank of the Dutch Meteorological Institute, which holds a record of all the seismic activity recorded in the Netherlands in the past 40 years. So these recordings of the Earth have been used throughout the last decade to estimate risk assessment decisions and the possible impact of future earthquakes and what impact they might have on people living in the area. During this research, we also visited and stayed with people in Groningen who were living with the earthquakes in order to gather their experiences and stories. What we found was that many feel anxiety from the uncertainty of the magnitude of future earthquakes, the breaking of dikes, the damage to their homes, and generally the disappointment of feeling abandoned by the government and industry who are doing this gas drilling venture. And many have been caught in legal battles with lawyers over the years as they fight for compensation to damages to their houses and their mental well-being. So speaking with people living with the earthquakes, we realized that they had become kind of hypersensitive to the sensation of these man-made earthquakes. Many are able to recall in extremely precise detail the sensation of this earthquake passing through their bodies and their homes, how it rumbles in the gut, how the sound changes over time, and some even claim to wake up in bed seconds before an earthquake is felt. And these encounters and stories inspired us to create the Intimate Earthquake Archive, which is an interactive installation where an audience can approach the geological archives of the Netherlands from an embodied perspective. We've selected number of seismic recordings from the digital archive, which in different ways have had significant effect on the bureaucratic, the political, and the public climate relating to the situation in Groningen. So if you could play video 2, please. We have transformed this data set into vibratory compositions that play out on the body through a specially designed tactile sonic vests equipped with bone and surface conducting transducers. So visitors are able to browse the archive by moving their bodies within a large spatial network of long-wave radio transmitter, which are embedded in these core samples that also have been taken from the Groningen area. And the Intimate Earthquake Archive, in the end, is intended to offer a space of meditation and of deep listening to the earth, one that gives an opportunity to mindfully reflect on how anthropocentric geological changes might be recorded, might be experienced and sensed by bodies and technologies, and how they enter into our collective and cultural and natural history. Nature-cultural history, I should say. So in 2018, we were invited to show this work at Ballroom Marfa in Far West, Texas, by curator Laura Copeland and philosopher Timothy Morton. This trip proved really fateful for me in the way of thinking about my own work, not least because I came into contact with Morton's philosophical concept around dark ecology, and particularly his formulation and use of the term ecological awareness. So I remember very clearly that on our way to the exhibition, we took a detour to the Trinity test site, the place where they first tested the atomic bomb. And it's in the middle of this pristine New Mexico desert, which is a kind of place of an immense sense of geological time. There are these underground caves and valleys that are made from ancient inland oceans and coral reefs. And then you end up at this military base where you can still find all these tiny green rocks called trinitite that have been created from the blast of the bomb that would, just redefine human history. And we were in the car on the way there, and we were listening to a podcast of Tim talking about their ideas about ecological awareness and this kind of eerie, uncanny awareness of the fact that all of our actions today will have consequences into the vast, incomprehensible future. And Tim used mercury as an example. So, it's not going away when you throw it in the trash, that it seeps into the environment, it bioaccumulates in some aquatic other, and eventually ends up in your body. So this kind of radical awareness of being intrinsically interconnected with other beings and other ecologies through vast time spent, which is not something that's really romantic or idyllic, but just kind of like an eeriness of ecological awareness. And this really hit home for me on this trip, going from experiencing the landscape, which seems so solid, so impermeable or unchangeable even, and ending up at this test site where you see people protesting along the highway about the health problems that they experienced living around the site for the last 70 years. And since this experience, I've tried to evoke a similar sense of ecological awareness through my own work. And I've become increasingly interested in figuring out how we deal with persistent materiality of our industrial and war and consumer products. How do they force us to reconsider the boundary between the body and the world, and how they, in a way, resist this Western Enlightenment subject that's all discrete and cut off from the environment. So, for instance, another thinker that I wanted to bring out is Heather Davis, who calls plastic time eaters, because it's made from fossil fuels that's been forming across thousands of years and then turned into this single-use container or fishing net, as we can see here, and then which will again exist in some form, some molecular form over the next incomprehensible time span. And I've increasingly found myself turning to fictional scenarios and sci-fi in attempting to evoke this kind of eeriness or this kind of ecological awareness that Morton is talking about. or to find a way of grasping the kind of time-eating concepts that Davis is talking about. And I recently realized that a lot of my earlier works dealt with creating technologies that somehow invite the wearer to fine-tune their senses to environmental change and to train their bodies to perceive, for instance, the more subtle signals of man-made earthquakes. And last year, when I came across this concept of sentinel species, there was also something that kind of clicked. And that was also about the time when I started working with Heather Leslie, who's an ecotoxicologist and expert on plastics at Vrije Universiteit in Amsterdam, and Juan Garcia Vallejo, who's an immunologist at Amsterdam UMC. And Juan and Heather are researching how our immune cells might react to microplastic particles inside our bodies. So microplastics for decades have been considered an issue of the ocean, and many marine organisms, from whales to mussels, have been considered the sentinel species of this contamination. Their sensitivity to pollution warns us about the state of their environment. But the concept of sentinel species, to me, also points out this kind of implicit hierarchy that shows the unequal distribution of toxicity, that there are always some bodies that are more exposed, more vulnerable, and more sensitive than others. But nevertheless, as Anat Singh pointedly states in this quote, contamination is always a shared condition and purity is not an option. So in our collaborative projects, Becoming a Sentinel Species, Juan, Heather, and I wanted to question this hierarchy by imagining a scenario where humans actively take on the role of becoming a sentinel species by exploring their inherent sensitivity to pollutants. So Becoming a Sentinel Species is a sci-fi work that follows two researchers who experimentally introduce microplastics collected from the sea into their own bodies. They isolate their own immune cells in vitro and contaminate them with microplastic particles. And through this process, they discover the psychotropic effects that produce hallucinations of returning to the primordial sea, which you can see here. So one video still. And in the video I'm going to show you now, you'll see this process of extracting their own immune cells, which are called macrophages, and the kind of ritualistic exploration of the fluid ecosystem they create in the lab in order to enable this encounter between their own immune cells and the microplastics and this immunological inflammation or reaction that creates these hallucinations. So if you could show video 3, please. Okay, so this degradation, producing this kind of hallucinatory de-evolution back to our shared muddy beginnings, is actually a reference to J.D. Ballard's famous sci-fi piece, The Drowned World. While the protagonists in The Drowned World find their human travels back through what Ballard calls archaeopsychic time as something that's traumatic and abject, the hallucinations in Becoming a Sentinel Species is rather intended to sort of create an evocation of a radical ecological awareness, an awareness about that the travel of microplastics from the oceans into our bodies is not that strange, since we arose from the oceans and we carry the ocean inside us in the shape of our blood and our bodily fluids. So being fluid is in fact what connects us with the world. So part of the film also follows the making of an actual experiment in creating what's called a biomarker from immune cells that we grew from my blood and infused them with microplastic particles, which you can see, which was the microscopic footage that was shown in the clip. And during our collaboration, I really learned a lot about immunology and its ties with our sense of self and the tensions between our bodies and the environment around us. I also started noticing the kind of language we use to describe the complexity of immunity. I realized that this language relies heavily on metaphors of war, for instance. We imagine the body as a kind of battleground where the immune system defends the body or the self from outside intruders or non-self. I learned that during the project, this kind of binary division between self and non-self is somewhat of an outdated mode of looking at immunology. For instance, pioneering immunologist Polly Matzinger argues that the immune system might be more concerned with what's dangerous to the body than with what's foreign. So this question of the cultural and cognitive implications of imagining and expanding upon our sense of immune self also inspired this commissioned work for Sonic Acts this past spring. The work is called Plastic Hypersea, and it's an augmented audio guide that invites listeners to experience the post-industrial site of NDSM in Amsterdam through a science fiction narrative. In the story, they're invited to imagine the NDSM wharf as a kind of future abandoned test site for experiments in extending one's sense of self to include and encompass the waters of the Amsterdam Canal system. These waters, which were so recently in contact with our bodies and our sewage systems, and which contains a whole host of traces of our everyday lives, from viruses to ecstasy, from microplastics to marine critters, challenges us to reconsider our sense of immunological self. But where looms the dangers of a complete dissolution of the self is also something it deals with. Ultimately, Plastic Hypersea asks the listeners to abandon these war metaphors haunting immunology and to contemplate a more expanded sense of self. It invites you to look at the site through the lens of speculation and science fiction and consider, for instance, what personal and philosophical and political and perhaps in the future legal consequences it might have if we really did consider the environment as a material integral part of ourselves. Okay, so the last work I wanted to share with you today is also the most recent one. It's called Sphagnum Time. And in this work, I got to explore a fascination that I've had, again, since I was a child, which is the bog bodies that are found in many of the Northern European countries. So bog bodies are a phenomenon where human bodies have been preserved in bogs for thousands of years due to the bog's acidic, oxygen-poor environments. I've always been really fascinated with the way in which the bog provided this kind of container that extends the materiality of the body across vast time spans, and the kinds of archaeological facts, but also stories that we tell about these bog bodies across different moments in time and also increasingly realizing that these stories often reflect the time in which the bog bodies have been found and the kind of technologies we use to extract data from them. So in sphagnum time, we encounter 3 bog bodies who were never found by the peat diggers in the 20th century. So sacrificed to the bog thousands of years ago, they've obtained a new form of subjectivity beyond the human, one that spans across the ecological circumstances they became part of acidic water, sphagnum mosses, trapped methane gas, and the bacterial ecosystems maintained in the bog. In the installation work, the 3 bog bodies act as kind of guides for a subsurface that's undergoing change. They communicate with us an understanding of time and change that seems beyond our reach, and one that requires listening to and observing the subjectivities and the rhythms that span beyond the lived experiences that we might have. And this one last image is just to show that I was very lucky to get to work with Grenzen Museum to Fotogrammmetrie-Scan their collection of bog bodies, which have provided the kind of raw material for the 3 fictional bog bodies that you will see in the work. So I hope that we have time to watch a little bit of the last video. Do we have time?
For thousands of years, the bog was the portal between the world of humans and the other world, the realm of the gods, ancestors, and demons. The bog is a transition zone, not water, nor soil, not living nor dead, something in between.
Humans have always found sacrifices in the bogs. Even when I was alive, we found...
I remember barrels of butter, intricate braids of human hair, dog skulls, bodies.
All of the things left in the bog that would otherwise decay. They became transformed and preserved.
When I was alive, I sat watching the glittering clouds of pollen blow over the surface of the bog, blowing along with leaves, nuts, the iridescent wings of flies. All was folded slowly, neatly down into the bog, into a time spiral.
This is how we became part of the bog too, part of that perpetual motion machine.
We entered the other world. Yes.
Do you remember when we met?
I remember becoming something else. I remember my blood leaving my body, seeping into the bog, slowly. Sour water penetrating my skin, filling my lungs, the life forms inside me dying out. The moss growing slowly, closer and closer around me, until it was tight, cradling my body. Then new kinds of organisms crossed over the boundary of my skin, working together with the moss to make me a part of this environment. Together we became something else, the other world. Human and peat moss and acid-loving microbes, and the bubbles of gas bursting into flames.
All right, that's all from my end. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for that great presentation. I think it was really interesting and really lovely to see what you did there. I didn't know that mods could be that interesting. For those of you who still have questions, you're going to be on Gather for the Q&A, and then you can ask your questions personally to you. And thank you very much for your time. Up next, there will be another input talk following at 11:45 by Moon Rivers, and you can follow that along as well, and hope to see you around.
Thank you.